There will be a provincial election next week. If you're lucky, you haven't heard too much about it. If you're unlucky, you've heard a whole lot about it. All the same, it inspired the topic of this week's episode, which is an election campaign that was fought in the provincial riding of St. Andrew, all the way back in 1955. In most of Ontario, this election was a snoozer, with the Tories winning 83 out of the 98 available seats. However, the battle in St. Andrew was significant, because the local Tory candidate wanted to defeat the one communist MPP at Queen's Park. Now, when I call this person a communist, I don't mean that in the Toronto Sun sense that he was on the left. I mean that he was a self-confessed card-carrying communist. This campaign was about what it meant to be a communist elected official in Canada, and it reflected a ferocious debate taking place within the Toronto Jewish community about who they should support and about who would support them. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller. And this is Muddy York.
We'll start off by talking about the riding where this campaign would be fought. The St. Andrew constituency doesn't exist anymore. It was a narrow riding that ran from the lake north to DuPont and from Palmerston, a few blocks west of Bathurst, to Huron, a few blocks east of Spadina. The most notable thing about St. Andrew was that it was very Jewish. We don't have any hard stats, but it probably had a Jewish plurality, and a Jewish candidate had won it for the last 7 elections. St. Andrew included Kensington Market and the Fashion District, but not as we know them today. Kensington Market wasn't a hipster haven in 1955. Instead, it was home to thousands of working-class Jewish immigrants. The Fashion District was anything but high-end. At that time, it was called the Garment District, because it was home to various textile factories employing thousands of poorly paid workers to produce fabric and clothing.
There were 2 major candidates. The first was the incumbent Joe Salzberg, and Salzberg was a communist. Now, the Communist Party had been banned in 1940, so officially he represented the Labour Progressive Party. But his communist beliefs were a pretty open secret. He was also beloved by an important part of the Toronto Jewish community. Salzberg was a constituency politician who was constantly working on his voters. It was said that it took him hours to walk up and down Spadina because he would constantly stop to visit shops along the way, meeting with people on the street, and offering help to any constituents who needed it. With the legislature at Queen's Park, Salzberg usually behaved like a social reformer, often proposing worthwhile legislation and winning the respect of conservative Premier Leslie Frost. For all that, he was still a communist, and he loyally followed orders as they arrived from Moscow. Communist rhetoric about the evils of capitalism had been an obvious appeal to working-class voters, with memories of the Depression. But his support also had a strong ethnic component. Salzberg was a Jew from the local community who spoke fluent Yiddish. He was also a scholar who could debate Jewish philosophy with anyone, from rabbis to shopkeepers. When he was first elected in 1943, the Communist Party represented itself as allies in the war against Hitler. They also pointed to a clause in the Soviet Constitution that banned anti-Semitism. These claims were more than a little disingenuous. The Soviets only fought Hitler after supporting him for 2 years as an ally, and Stalin was an anti-Semite who increasingly persecuted Soviet Jews once the war had come to an end. By the 1950s, this persecution had become impossible to conceal. However, Salzberg continued to follow the party line and loyally defended the various show trials and purges. When Stalin died in March of 1953, Salzberg described him as one of the greatest of the great of all time.
Salzburg's main opponent was a local city councilor named Alan Grossman. Grossman came from the same working-class Jewish background as Salzburg, but after a rough start, he had become a successful insurance agent, which allowed him to move his family to a nicer home near Davenport at the north end of the riding. He represented the growing middle class within the Jewish community. Grossman was a Tory. Many people felt like he was an odd fit for the PCs because he supported then progressive causes like a minimum wage law and had even tried to unionize the agents at his company. However, Grossman believed in free enterprise, and he tended to be suspicious of government bureaucracy. Most of all, he was intensely anti-communist. In his mind, the Communist Party was playing the Jewish community for fools, soliciting Jewish support in Canada while persecuting Jews in the Soviet Union. He also worried that electing a communist encouraged non-Jews to distrust the Jewish community. He wanted to, as he said, remove the red blot, and thought that he had the best chance to do it.
Previous efforts to defeat Salzburg, including one by future mayor Nathan Phillips, had all failed, but Grossman felt that the circumstances were shifting in his favor. He believed that people were voting for Salzburg in spite of his communist beliefs, not because of them. They voted for him because he was a charismatic social reformer. His communist beliefs were actually weighing down his support. In the last provincial election, Salzburg's margin of victory had fallen almost 75%, and the only other communist at Queen's Park had been defeated in a neighboring riding. The riding of St. Andrew was also changing. As Jews reached the middle class, they began leaving the riding and moving to what were then the northern suburbs along Lawrence and Eglinton. They were frequently replaced by recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, many who had fled Soviet oppression and would never support a communist candidate. Despite these changes, the communist electoral machine was still formidable and vicious. This is how Grossman described it. It will be hard for anyone to believe it, but then the communists had the strongest organization in that part of the city. They had hundreds, if not thousands, of dedicated workers who would go through hell for their candidates. And in that period, some of them were even supported by the Toronto Star. But their tactics were abominable. I remember the occasion when Phillips ran against Salzburg provincially. When I told them the communists were likely to break it before the campaign was over, they all scoffed. But that's exactly what happened. They broke in, I think the night before the election, and made a hell of a mess of that place. From that day on, I always had security at our committee rooms. You might think that Grossman was exaggerating because he was a Tory and they were his opposition. However, former NDP leader David Lewis made similar claims, writing that the communists would move hundreds of voters into a constituency for the duration of an election campaign. This, quote, was said to be a regular feature of communist activity during provincial elections in the Spadina district.
Grossman had several strategies to meet these challenges. For one thing, his network within the Jewish community was almost as good as Salzburg's. We mentioned that he had been an insurance agent, but that was a very different job in his time. Unlike today, customers would usually deal with the same insurance agent, often for as long as they worked at the company. These agents would make regular rounds to meet with their clients, making sure they had paid their premiums and delivering any payouts. The result is that a large portion of the community already knew Grossman from his years of insurance work. As a city councilor, he was also very accessible to his constituents. He used what he called the pothole system, regularly walking the streets of his ward, looking for problems like potholes, and making a fuss at City Hall until they had been fixed. Rob Ford used a very similar system during his years on city council. Grossman was also willing to be as rough as his opponents. This is one story that he tells about the campaign. One of the communist workers came rolling into our committee room and was yelling and screaming about our tearing down his signs. Andy, that's Andy Laszlo, one of Grossman's top organizers, had in his hand a large staple gun, used for putting up signs. I stood there and watched as he lectured Andy face to face, and finally Andy said to him, "Are you finished?" He said yes, And Andy let go of the staple gun and it fell on the guy's foot.
When you mentioned the staple gun, I thought that story was going to be a lot more violent.
Actually, there would be violence. After the first couple of weeks, a policeman had to be posted to Grossman's house to deal with the threatening calls that he was receiving. Communist Party workers would follow Grossman and his family wherever they went. There would also be street fights between the different campaign teams as they put up their own signs and tried to tear down their opponents.
The Communist Party newspaper repeatedly accused Grossman of consorting with fascists. It was also eager to stir up tensions between Jews and the newer immigrants living in the south of the riding, claiming that Grossman was surrounded by Slavic fascists, anti-Semites, many of them Nazi collaborators, throat cutters, and murderers of Jews. Grossman tried to turn this into an advantage at many public debates held during the campaign. I brought out an anti-Semitic Grossman cartoon showing me with a dagger in my hand. I pointed to this as the kind of tactic employed by Joe and his cohorts. There was a hush when I told them this. Most of those present were Joe's supporters. They had been led to believe that he was a man of principle, a great liberal, and not someone who would stoop to this kind of tactic. Joe had always managed to play the role of the dignified leader and statesman who was above the fray. I could sense that even with this audience, Joe, for the first time, was on the defensive. The next communist tactic involved the entry of a last-minute candidate into the race. Elizabeth Longfeld claimed that she was an independent candidate campaigning on moral integrity and political purity. She spent almost her entire campaign attacking Grossman for his partial ownership of the 300 Tavern on College Street, even though he had actually sold his share months ago. The Grossman campaign eventually discovered that she had been an election worker for Salzburg's 4 years earlier, but decided not to make a big deal about this discovery. As Grossman said, I'd been going around knocking on doors and hadn't heard any person to refer to these charges at all. It shouldn't have been that much of a surprise. Toronto Protestants may have seen liquor as a wicked and sinful, but Toronto Jews generally didn't care.
Grossman couldn't claim innocence in these dirty political games. One of his people managed to drive a dump truck into the middle of a Salzburg motorcade, wreaking havoc on the proceedings. On election day, 40 special constables were assigned to monitor the polls in St. Andrew. The chief returning officer was a Tory and arranged for them to be driven to their posts in cars covered with Grossman signs. Salzburg was furious and nearly came to blows with the returning officer. His mood was not improved when he learned that someone had poured sugar into his gas tank. Some low-tech tactics that they used to use in those days. Now, after the votes had been counted, Alan Grossman had won St. Andrew by 743 votes, getting 5,019 compared to 4,276 for Joe Salzburg. The results are more interesting if you break them down according to the different parts of the riding. Grossman won the area south Queen Street, where the newer immigrants from Eastern Europe lived. But the vote totals were too small to make a big difference because most of the newcomers hadn't lived in Canada long enough to become Canadian citizens. Salzburg won the area between College and Queen. This was the center of the Toronto Jewish community and had always been his strongest area of support. But he only won by about 500 votes, which was much smaller than his margin of victory in previous elections. The area from College to Bloor was more diverse and almost perfectly split between Grossman and Salzburg. Grossman's margin of victory came from the area north of Bloor, which was the richest part of the riding, and where he won at least twice as many votes as Salzburg did. Looking at these results, one could say that Salzburg held the traditional working-class Jewish vote, but this voting bloc was declining, and it was being replaced by more recent immigrants and a new generation of Jews who were eager to join the middle class.
4 months later, Salzburg would run in a federal by-election for the same area and come in third, losing to Grossman's campaign manager. 2 years later, he would leave the Communist Party due to a combination of Soviet anti-Semitism and Soviet repression of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. His political rehabilitation became quickly and he was presented as the man who had taken a principled stage against Soviet anti-Semitism. The Jewish establishment that had reviled him would welcome him into their ranks, and he became a long-time columnist for the Canadian Jewish News. There's an important question to ask about how to assess Salzburg's political career. He was by all accounts a conscientious and hard-working representative. Within the legislature, he behaved like a liberal social reformer, making a substantive contribution to legislative debates and fighting for the rights of the disadvantaged. The problem is that he did these good works while professing support for a totalitarian ideology that murdered tens of millions of people. For Grossman, this election was the start of a distinguished political career. He would serve as an MPP for the next 20 years and spent 15 years in cabinet, becoming only the second Jewish cabinet minister in Ontario history. His son Larry would succeed him upon his retirement, and in 1987 he became the first Jewish leader of the Ontario PCs. Larry was a centrist. When challenged about his conservative credentials, he liked to invoke his father's role in defeating the last communist at Queen's Park.
Grossman also had an effect on the relationship between Jews and the Progressive Conservative Party. The presence of a Jewish MPP from a multicultural riding offered a new perspective in a caucus that was overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. Grossman also had an effect on the relationship between Jews and the Progressive Conservative Party. The presence of a Jewish MPP from a multicultural riding offered a new perspective in a caucus that was overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. Grossman and Ukrainian John Yaremko from the neighboring riding of Bellwoods were the two ethnics, as they were called in those days, in the provincial cabinet. Grossman's appointment to cabinet also represented a major change to the image of Ontario Tories, who had previously been seen as a party that wasn't friendly to Jews. So, as you cast your vote next Thursday, just remember that if someone says that elections have never been this dirty before, they're not listening to enough history podcasts. Now, we want to do something a little new right now. Something we'd mentioned before is that we are going to start reading some of the messages that we get. And we got this message from Jordan Teasdale.
I like that.
Hi there. I am from Brantford and grew up going on shopping and theater trips to Toronto as a kid, eventually living near Hyde Park and the Junction as an adult. Now live in Vancouver, and I've been really homesick lately. Your podcast is giving me a good dose of home with the history of TO. Love the background music you use as well. Makes the episodes feel calmer in a way. Now, it's important to note that if you write us an email and tell us how great we are, you're going to win us over. We are an easy sell. So I'd like to encourage all of our listeners to do that, and we might read them in the future.
So where could they do that if they actually want to reach out, Adam?
Well, we are on Twitter at Toronto_history. We're on Blue Sky at Muddy York History. That's all one word. And we are on Facebook at Toronto History. You can find us there, and that will also direct you to nothing. I don't know what that would direct you to. So, oh, right. Yes. You can also reach us at our email, which is muddy_york@outlook.com. And we'll see you all again in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, guys. And last, remembering, sorry to do this again, but like and share, review, rate this podcast. It's how it ends up in other people's feeds. If you love history, keep sharing it. And thanks. See you later. And